The desert outside Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, doesn't just feel empty, it feels forgotten. Dry winds whip across sun-cracked plains where little moves and less thrives. But just beneath this sun-scorched silence, something monstrous stirred for years, something hidden inside a nondescript white trailer. Parked at the end of a dusty road near Elephant Butte Lake, inside that trailer, David Parker Ray didn't just torture people, he rewrote the definition of human cruelty. Locals would later call him the Toy Box Killer, but even that nickname couldn't contain the horrors he orchestrated behind those thin metal walls. David Parker Ray looked ordinary, tall, aging, soft-spoken. He worked as a mechanic for the state, kept to himself, lived with his daughter and girlfriend, and never caused much trouble. But like so many serial predators, the ordinariness was the mask. Beneath it festered a man obsessed with control, sadism, and ritualistic torture. Ray kept detailed journals hundreds of pages long, filled with cold, meticulous records of his crimes. He wasn't impulsive. He was calculated, methodical, and deeply disturbed, operating not in a frenzy, but with the precise coldness of a man engineering nightmares. Inside his trailer, which he called his toy box, Ray constructed a chamber of unholy devices. The walls were lined with surgical instruments, whips, pulleys, clamps, saws, leg spreaders, and electrical devices. He had mounted a gynecological chair in the center of the trailer. Over it hung mirrors, so his victims could watch themselves being tortured. And if that weren't enough, Ray often recorded his sessions on video and sometimes played a chilling pre-recorded cassette tape for his victims, describing in agonizing detail what he planned to do to them. This was not just torture, it was theater, but Ray didn't act alone. His crimes were a collaborative ritual. His daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray, and his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, weren't just bystanders, they were participants. Jessie helped lure victims. Cindy helped restrain and abuse them. Together, they hunted mostly sex workers, vulnerable women no one would report missing, drugged with barbiturates, chained to the bed, blindfolded, and often silenced with gags. These women would awake inside the toy box without memory of how they got there, only to find themselves at the mercy of a man who referred to himself as their master. What made David Parker Ray's crimes especially horrific was the level of psychological torture he inflicted. He didn't just mutilate and assault, he wanted his victims to be broken, to feel completely powerless. His pre-recorded introduction began with him calmly explaining that escape was impossible, that no one would help them, and that they now existed for his pleasure alone. "Hello, bitch." The tape began, as if addressing cattle. He'd keep them for days, sometimes weeks, before disposing of them like refuse. Some victims were released, too traumatized to speak. Others vanished entirely. In March 1999, everything unraveled. One woman, Cynthia Vigil, changed everything. Lured under the pretense of a date, Cynthia found herself chained inside the trailer like so many others. But after 3 days of torment, while Ray was briefly out of the room and Cindy Hendy was distracted, Cynthia seized a chance. She grabbed keys from a table, unlocked her restraints, and stabbed Hendy with an ice pick. Naked, bleeding, and terrified, she bolted out of the trailer and ran barefoot through the desert until she stumbled into a nearby mobile home, screaming for help. The woman who opened the door saw more than just a terrified victim. She saw the beginning of a revelation that would horrify the nation. The police arrested Ray and Hendy that same day. When they searched the trailer, seasoned investigators recoiled in disbelief. The torture chamber wasn't just real, it was beyond anything they had ever seen. Diagrams of human anatomy covered the walls. There were surgical tools covered in stains, videotapes, chains, and even collars etched with names. And inside a safe, they found Ray's diary, his fantasy logs, describing what he'd done to dozens of women. But it wasn't just the trailer. The property itself was a crypt. Ray had access to Elephant Butte Lake and other remote desert locations, and many of the women he wrote about were never found. Authorities brought cadaver dogs. They excavated sites around the lake. They even drained parts of it, but not a single body was ever recovered. Whether Ray buried them so well they were never found, or whether he destroyed the remains entirely, remains an open question. And it cast a terrifying shadow. How many had vanished into that desert without a trace? When the trial began, The case was a logistical nightmare. Cynthia Vigil survived. So did another woman, Angelica Montano, who had also escaped and gone to police years earlier but was ignored with new attention. Her testimony helped build a profile of Ray's methodology. Then, a third survivor named Kelly Garrett emerged, piecing together her drugged memories of the trailer, the abuse, and how she had mysteriously vanished for days in 1996. But while the survivor's courage was astonishing, the trial itself was grueling. Defense attorneys challenged their memories. Others claimed the women were exaggerating. And Ray, he smiled in court. Ultimately, David Parker Ray accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison for kidnapping and torture. Cindy Hendy, who testified against him, received a reduced sentence and served 19 years before her release. Jessie Ray, his daughter, was convicted on charges related to the abduction of Kelly Garrett and received a lighter sentence. But David Parker Ray never served his time, just a year into his incarceration. Before he could reveal where any bodies were buried, he died of a heart attack in 2002. He took his secrets and likely the names of dozens of victims with him. After David Parker Ray's sudden death in 2002, a strange silence fell over the case, one that felt more like suffocation than closure. No final confession, no last-minute revelation of burial sites, no peace for the families of the missing. It was as if the monster had simply evaporated, leaving behind a landscape littered with unanswered questions. Investigators had hoped Ray would bargain, trading locations for leniency, but his heart gave out, and with it, the map to his atrocities died too. What remained was a hollow shell of a trial record, a locked trailer, and 3 women whose lives were shattered. But who survived? Cynthia Vigil, the woman whose escape had brought Ray down, tried to rebuild her life, but she would never be the same. Her memories were fragmented and nightmarish. The clink of chains, the whir of recording devices, the sound of her own screams echoing off metal walls. Cynthia had been a sex worker, someone society often overlooks, but her courage proved undeniable. She testified. She endured humiliation in the courtroom. She let the world see the scars. And yet, she was haunted by the knowledge that she was likely one of the few who got out alive. Angelica Montano, another survivor, had reported Ray to the police years before Cynthia ever escaped. But back then, they didn't listen. Her story sounded too surreal. A strange man with a trailer in the desert, a torture chamber filled with surgical tools. It seemed absurd until Cynthia's escape proved every horrific word. Angelica didn't get justice. She died of heart failure not long after the case reopened. Her heart broken not only by what was done to her, but by how many refused to believe her. In some ways, the silence of the system was more lethal than Ray himself. Then there was Kelly Garrett. Her case stood apart. She wasn't a stranger pulled from the streets. She was a friend of Ray's daughter, Jessie. Kelly had an argument with her husband one night and stormed out. Jessie offered to cheer her up, took her out drinking, and drugged her drink. When Kelly woke up, she was inside the toy box. After days of torment, Ray released her near her home, disoriented and with no memory. Her husband thought she'd cheated and abandoned her. The police never filed a report. Her kidnapping disappeared from the world until the truth surfaced. Years later, Ray's methods weren't just physical, they were psychological labyrinths. He used truth serums, amnesia-inducing drugs, and sensory deprivation to erase his victims' ability to trust their own memories. He recorded his sessions, he gaslight his captives, and after days or weeks of horror, if he did release them, he counted on them being too broken or to disbelieve to ever bring him to justice. It worked for years. His crimes stretched back decades, possibly to the 1950s, and when his diaries were reviewed, investigators suspected as many as 60 women may have passed through that trailer. 60 souls, most never found. The FBI launched one of the largest victim identification efforts in New Mexico history. They released images from Ray's property, jewelry, clothing, personal items, desperate for someone to recognize a lost loved one. Women came forward. Some recognized rings, others recognized tattoos. A few had stories that matched what was in the diaries, but without bodies. There was no way to confirm death. It became a case of living ghosts. The toy box killer left behind. Not a graveyard, but a void. Victims not officially dead. Families without closure. And a justice system struggling to sentence someone already in the ground. Cindy Hendy became the linchpin. In exchange for her testimony, she confessed in detail to how the torture sessions unfolded. She spoke of how Ray kept his trailer clean, how he disposed of evidence, how he recorded victims with both video and audio. She admitted to laughing during the sessions. She admitted to helping drug and restrain women. And yet, after serving just 19 years, she was released in 2019 into a country that had almost forgotten her name. No new charges, no civil suits, just a quiet re-entry into society. For many, her freedom was a bitter wound. Jessie Ray, too, walked free. She served just a few years. Her involvement had been mostly in luring victims, though, that alone was enough to damn her in the court of public opinion. She remained silent after her release, retreating into obscurity. But her role in helping her father kidnap Kelly Garrett proved something chilling. This wasn't just a serial killer, it was a family business. Generational evil. David Parker. Ray raised his daughter in the image of control, cruelty, and manipulation. She didn't rebel against it. She joined in. The darkness wasn't just inside him, it spread. Even after Ray's death, the trailer remained a symbol of evil. For years, it sat impounded, locked, and sealed while the FBI combed over every inch. Eventually, it was dismantled and destroyed. Authorities didn't want it becoming a morbid tourist attraction, but it left behind an impression in the cultural memory. The horror of a serial predator who left behind no corpses, only survivors and speculation. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, but the true weight of the story didn't live in headlines. It lived in the quiet despair of the women who walked into that trailer and barely crawled out. In the end, the story of David Parker Ray is not just about a sadist, it's about a system that failed to believe survivors, failed to act when victims cried for help, and perhaps worst of all, failed to uncover the full extent of the crimes. Ray didn't need to hide bodies, he only needed a society unwilling to look. What justice was achieved came not through policing brilliance, but through one woman's desperate sprint through the desert, barefoot and bleeding. Determined not to die chained to a gynecological chair, that woman saved herself and in doing so, saved dozens more from unspeakable fate.